Is the sheer amount of suffering that animals have to endure in nature the most powerful objection against Christianity, as some skeptics have come to claim? Well, maybe, but what I'm going to show you in this video is that it's by far not as powerful of an objection as you may think. Let's jump into it right away. Since Cosmic Skeptic published what he called his biggest case against Christianity based on animal suffering, lots of people on YouTube have come to talk about the issue, including me, as I made a response video to Alex's argument. After that, I've kept looking into the problem of animal suffering, and I learned a bunch of new things, and so I thought I'd share some of this with you guys. Now, just to be clear, what you're about to watch is in no way meant to be a comprehensive defense or theodicy for animal suffering. Instead, this is quite simply a compilation of issues which I believe to be of fundamental importance when it comes to considering what the problem of animal suffering actually is, and how one frames the discussion around it. So let's get started with the first such issue, with what can be called the notion of the sum total of all suffering. When skeptics raise the problem of human or animal suffering, they typically provide a list of real-life and historical examples, and there is nothing categorically wrong with that. So, when talking about human suffering, they might, in building their case, cite the Holocaust, cancer, child abuse, war crimes, etc. They usually also provide numbers to show how many people are affected by the travesties they mention. Cosmic Skeptic is no exception to the rule when offering his case from animal suffering.
The number of wild vertebrates alone is thought to be somewhere between 10 to the power of 11 and 10 to the power of 14. That's 10 with at least 11 zeros after it. We're talking trillions of animals, each one of whom will, under the unerring supervision of an all-powerful, all-loving God, likely experience more fear, devastation, and suffering in their lifetimes than we human beings are even capable of imagining.
Now, when being presented with various types and instances of suffering all at once, one can easily forget the key fact. No sentient creature actually experiences the sum total of all suffering there is. To illustrate this, imagine you're sitting in a class and are suffering from a toothache. Let's call it toothache T. There may be another person in class who is also suffering from toothache T. Now, while we can say that there are two T's in this class, there is no sentient experience of two T. Similarly, although there are millions of animals and all sorts and levels of suffering featured in the world, no animal has a sentient experience of all the suffering and pain the skeptic lists. This isn't to say that a theodicy or defense doesn't have to deal with the totality of suffering as reality presents it to us. Not at all. But it is to say that the emotional weight one may feel when being presented with long lists and numbers related to the suffering in the world can easily create confusion about what the suffering as it is experienced in reality actually is. This brings me right to my next point. Even with all the pain that each animal experiences, it is far from clear that it feels that pain in the same way that we do. In fact, it's quite unlikely in many cases. Entire classes of animals simply don't have pain receptors or even a nervous system that's as developed as ours. In fact, this applies to all invertebrates to some degree, which make up no less than 95% of the entire animal kingdom. On top of that, it seems far from clear that all animal species have the capacity to anticipate and remember pain as we do. In other words, animals may not experience fear in the face of suffering and trauma as a response to it, or at least not to the same extent as humans do. Thus, a nuanced discussion of animal suffering cannot start with the unquestioned assumption that an animal's experience of pain is analogous to what you and I experience. In contrast, what we are justified in affirming, and this brings me to my third point, is that an animal's capacity to feel pain is also the capacity which allows it to feel pleasure. That's what sentience basically means, the capacity to have sense experiences, both pleasant and painful. This means that for God to create animals with the capacity to feel pleasure implies or may imply that he also creates them with the capacity to feel pain. Of course, the skeptic will immediately object with, but why? Surely an all-powerful God could have created sentient animals with two sets of receptors, one of pleasure and one of pain. Or, alternatively, he could have created them with the one capacity of sentience as we know it, while ordering the world in a way that animals would only experience pleasure, but not pain. That's a good point, but it is built on yet another unquestioned assumption, one which says that pain is exclusively negative, an annoying side effect of our physical existence. Given our culture's obsession with instant pleasure, it isn't surprising that anyone would think that. However, it's a far too simplistic perspective. When you build a campfire, it's the very knowledge of the possibility of burning your hand when you come too close to the heat that makes you pull back so that your hand doesn't catch fire and ends up in flames. In contrast, people who suffer from Hansen's disease, or better known as leprosy, lack the ability to feel anything in the affected limbs, which can lead to cases of people burning entire parts of their bodies or cutting themselves without even realizing it. There are even cases of patients in India having had their fingers eaten by rats while asleep. Based on observations related to leprosy, a range of studies have been conducted investigating the relationship between the experience of pain and bodily integrity. One of the most influential works is called The Gift of Pain by Yancey and Brand. Brand was a medical doctor in India who had extensive experience in treating leprosy. The authors conducted a range of experiments and studies which tested whether patients would stop engaging in harmful behavior when painless stimuli, such as lights or sounds that go off on their clothes, indicate that they should stop doing what they're doing. I'm not going to go into details here, but what the authors essentially concluded from all their studies is that unless there is a painful stimulus in response to behavior on our own part or to external influences which may harm our bodies, we lack the motivation to actually get out of pain's way. This basically means that pain is necessary to maintain bodily integrity. The second response to the objection that God could have ordered the world in a way that animals would only experience pleasure but no pain brings us to the only point in this video that comes close to an actual defense, which is we find ourselves in a world that is, surprise, surprise, ordered by the laws of nature. It's the law-like regularity of nature, or nomic regularity as it is sometimes called, that makes science possible, which is a pretty good thing. However, any system that's ordered or engineered faces inherent constraints in terms of how much each aspect of the system can be optimized. For example, speed, safety, gas consumption, comfort and aesthetics are all aspects car engineers consider when they set out to build a new vehicle. But it's simply not possible to build a model which maximizes each one of these aspects. So a fast car may not be most efficient in terms of mileage, whereas the most comfortable and beautiful model may not be the fastest. In the same way, when it comes to the universe with all its physical constants and to planet Earth with all its different ecosystems inhabited by all sorts of sentient creatures, it may well be that in setting up this complex system, it was not possible for God to allow for sentient existence to be characterized by pleasure only and not by pain also. Now, to this the skeptic will most likely reply and say, but if that's the case, God is not omnipotent. Well, not quite, because the suggestion is that it's due to logical constraints that come with a physical universe as a system that features values such as mathematical order and beauty, that pain may be inevitable. A Christian defense against animal suffering that makes reference to nomic regularity suggests that the best possible world featuring a physical universe with living creatures that experience pleasure may also be a world in which they experience pain. And that suggestion is independent of the question of whether God created the universe or whether it came about by different means. Again, the skeptic may respond and say, well, but then you're saying that God is bound by logic, which again means that he is not omnipotent. Well, there are all sorts of reasons why this rejoinder is problematic, and one of them is that the majority of Christian philosophers and theologians don't consider divine omnipotence to encompass the idea of God performing logical impossibilities. And that's simply because logically impossible things, such as married bachelors or square circles, aren't actually things, but they are nonsensical, non-existing non-entities. As C.S. Lewis said, nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk it about God. But there's something even more important. Note that, though not always, or at least not always explicitly, the skeptic brings up the problem of animal suffering by claiming that it is logically incompatible with the notion of an all-loving and all-powerful God. Now, when it comes to the issue of God's omnipotence, and the skeptics claim that an omnipotent God should even be able to do the logically impossible, the Christian could simply grant that for the sake of argument. By doing so, the problem of animal suffering would immediately evaporate. Why? Well, if God's omnipotence means that he can perform logical incompatibilities, then the skeptics claim that there is a supposed logical contradiction between the existence of a loving God and animal suffering simply isn't a problem anymore. Because again, it's the skeptic, him or herself, who is telling us that allowing for such logical inconsistencies should be possible for an omnipotent God. Now, from the complex issue of logic and nomic regularity, back again to something very basic. People like Cosmic Skeptic contends that while there may be no logical incompatibility between the reality of animal suffering and the existence of God, there is simply too much suffering to consider the existence of God a plausible option. Formulated this way, we are dealing with the so-called evidential problem of animal suffering or of evil in general, as opposed to the logical problem of animal suffering or of evil. Now, the evidential version of this problem raises a very simple question, one which again is often forgotten. What amount of suffering would be acceptable to the skeptic? Where would he or she draw the line and say that with this specific amount of suffering, the notion of God's existence starts to become plausible? This is important because when the skeptic brings up the evidential problem of animal suffering, there's an implicit claim lurking underneath the surface, even though the skeptic may not be aware of it. It's the claim that if the level of suffering we find in reality were lowered, theism would move from implausibility to plausibility. But where does the skeptic draw that line in a way that doesn't come across as random? I mean, I don't know how many wild animals die of starvation each year, but let's say it's 10 million. Now, a skeptic might say that, well, if it were only 10,000, the notion of God's existence would become plausible. But why 10,000 exactly instead of 10,003 or 9,824? On what grounds can one draw the line at 10,000 or at any other number for that matter? You see, the claim that there is too much suffering really does mean that some specific level or number is not too much, and since it's the skeptic who is putting forward the claim, it seems that he or she owes us a plausible, non-random answer to the question of where the threshold lies. I'm not saying that this lets the Christian off the hook and that we don't need to offer a defense anymore against the problem of animal suffering. But I am saying that the skeptic too has work to do by fleshing out what he or she actually means by saying that there is too much animal suffering, in order to clarify what the problem that he or she is proposing actually is. And this brings us to another very basic yet crucial issue. Animals don't just experience suffering but also pleasure, and it's far from clear that their experience of pain outweighs their experience of pleasure. In fact, there is an argument to be made that natural selection will favor animals that are generally happy, since feeling happy is a more advantageous psychological state than feeling sad or terrified. This was the key point of my initial response to Cosmic Skeptic. Now, the main criticism I received for it by commenters was that in advancing my argument, I relied on one source only, though my critics didn't seem to realize that this in itself did nothing to actually address my argument. Not only that, but in their criticism, they themselves didn't cite any sources to challenge the point I made, which is, well, not only ironic, but kind of self-defeating. Be that as it may, what I found was that none other than Charles Darwin himself seems to have shared the very perspective which I've put forward in my video. Now, I'm not suggesting that Darwin denied that animals suffer, because he didn't. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted objects which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. However, pain and suffering wasn't the end of the story for Darwin, which is why he also said that when we reflect on this struggle, we may console ourselves with the full belief that the war of nature is not incessant, that no fear is felt, that death is generally prompt, and that the vigorous, the healthy, and the happy survive and multiply. The full belief that the happy survive and multiply. Yes, this makes sense, doesn't it? If natural selection picks out advantageous traits among animals, we shouldn't be surprised that evolution will produce happy rather than unhappy animals. Does this mean that animals don't suffer? No. However, as I've mentioned before, given that the problem of animal suffering can be emotionally charged, it is important to get a clear perspective on what the problem actually is and to be nuanced in our assessment of what animal existence actually looks like. Essentially, with everything that I've talked about, I've shown that the skeptic's case against Christianity based on animal suffering is not as strong as some may take it to be. However, let me also make clear that the Christian defense is not limited to mitigating the claims of the skeptic only. The Christian worldview has further and even richer resources available to tackle the problem of animal suffering. So even if I end up wrong on a point discussed here, this wouldn't be a major problem for the Christian case. For example, the Christian notion of animal soul making, the whole topic of heaven and the animal afterlife, make a huge difference when it comes to forming a defense. I just might make a separate video about this. So if you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments if you'd like to see another one on this topic. And do check out my first response to Cosmic Skeptic's biggest argument against Christianity based on animal suffering, in which I basically turn his own case against atheism. Thank you for watching and see you over there.